The concept of race, as a systematic categorization of human differences, did not exist in its current form throughout much of history. Instead, perceptions of human diversity were largely shaped by cultural, religious, and ethnic factors. The systematic invention of race emerged during specific historical epochs, often tied to political, social, and economic developments. The concept of race, as understood today, was absent in antiquity, where identity was shaped by kinship, culture, occupation, and religion rather than biological determinism. In antiquity, human diversity was acknowledged but not systematized into a hierarchy of immutable racial categories. Ancient societies, including the Greeks and Romans, did not interpret physical differences as immutable or hierarchical markers of human worth. Instead, identity was tied to one's cultural, linguistic, or social group. People often integrated into new societies through cultural assimilation, learning languages, or adopting local customs. For example, barbarians, groups seen as outsiders to Greco-Roman civilization, could assimilate and become part of Roman society by adopting Roman ways. Although ancient societies recognized physical differences such as skin color or facial features, they were not imbued with the modern connotations of racial hierarchy. Greek historian Herodotus, often called the father of history, noted physical traits like skin color when describing peoples such as the Colchians or Ethiopians, but did not ascribe moral or intellectual inferiority based on these differences. He explained variations as environmental adaptations rather than markers of inherent human inequality. Artistic depictions from the Mediterranean world further reflected this understanding. For instance, African individuals were represented in Greek and Roman art with realistic physical features without attaching moral or hierarchical judgments. This perspective sharply contrasts with later racial ideologies that associated physical traits with worth or capability. In antiquity, identity was often derived from one's family lineage or societal role. The Bible's genealogical accounts, such as those in Genesis, exemplify the importance of familial and tribal connections. Similarly, occupations played a critical role in defining individuals' social status and contributions to society. A farmer, soldier, or artisan was recognized for their societal role rather than their physical traits. Religious and philosophical systems in antiquity promoted a form of universalism that downplayed physical differences. Christianity, for example, preached the spiritual equality of all humans before God, although it later became a tool for cultural exclusion in medieval Europe. Similarly, Greek philosophers like Aristotle and Plato focused on cultural and intellectual development as markers of human achievement rather than biological determinism. The ancient Mediterranean was a hub of trade and cultural exchange, facilitating extensive interactions among diverse populations. Intermarriage was common, particularly in regions under empires like Alexander the Great's or the Roman Empire. These unions were often strategic, aimed at strengthening political alliances rather than emphasizing ethnic purity. This practice further underscores the lack of rigid racial boundaries in the ancient world. The concept of race in the European Middle Ages, while not fully developed into the systematic biological classifications of later periods, began to take shape through cultural, religious, and proto-biological ideas. This period saw the development of practices and ideologies that created hierarchies based on perceived differences among human groups. Religion was central to medieval racialization. In the Christian West, Jews were among the earliest communities subject to racialized treatment. Their distinct religious identity was linked with stereotypes and physical caricatures, such as the infamous depiction of Jews possessing horns or having a supposed Jewish stench. These physical and cultural attributions were rooted in theological narratives that framed Jews as perpetual outsiders, marked by their rejection of Christ. Such stereotypes were codified through laws requiring Jews to wear identifying badges and live in segregated areas. Islam was another significant axis of medieval racialization. The Crusades not only militarized the distinction between Christians and Muslims, but also racialized it by portraying Muslims as morally and culturally inferior. These distinctions were tied to European Christianity's universalizing mission and its effort to consolidate internal unity against an external other. The Middle Ages saw the emergence of legal frameworks that institutionalized racial and ethnic distinctions. The Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, for example, mandated that Jews and Muslims wear distinct clothing to visually separate them from Christians. These decrees, reinforced by local laws, were precursors to the racial governance systems seen in later periods. Canon law, while primarily religious, played a biopolitical role in governing heretical populations, blurring the lines between religious and racial identities. Jews, in particular, were subjected to intense surveillance, which regulated their economic activities and residential patterns. This legal and administrative control helped construct Jews as a distinct and marginalized group within medieval European society. The racialization of groups in the Middle Ages was also mediated through cultural artifacts. Maps, such as the Hereford Mappa Mundi, depicted the world as divided into hierarchical zones, with Europe occupying a central and superior position. Regions inhabited by others were portrayed as exotic, strange, or monstrous. These visual representations reinforced a sense of European identity as civilized and superior, contrasting with the dehumanized depictions of non-Europeans. Literature also played a role in shaping racialized narratives. Works such as Chaucer's Prioris's Tale amplified the ritual murder libel, portraying Jews as malevolent figures capable of heinous acts against Christians. These stories circulated widely, embedding racialized stereotypes in popular imagination and communal memory. Economic factors also influenced medieval racial practices. Jews were indispensable to the financial systems of medieval Europe, often serving as moneylenders in a society where Christians were prohibited from charging interest. This economic role, however, made them targets of resentment and persecution. Pogroms and expulsions often followed accusations of financial exploitation or ritual murder, as in the case of the 1255 execution of Jews in Lincoln. Similarly, the expansion of Christendom through the Crusades and trade brought Europeans into contact with a variety of cultures. These encounters often led to the construction of hierarchies that framed non-Christians, particularly Muslims and Africans, as inferior. The racialized language used to describe these groups laid the groundwork for later European colonial ideologies. Medieval racialization intersected with gender in significant ways. The portrayal of Jewish women as seductive or unclean contributed to the broader demonization of Jews. Similarly, Muslim women were exoticized in European literature, their perceived sensuality reinforcing racialized notions of moral and cultural difference. The 17th century marked a pivotal moment in the development of modern racial classification. as intellectual, scientific, and socio-political factors converge to create new ways of categorizing human diversity. The works of key thinkers, colonial expansions, and the increasing reliance on physical traits for human taxonomy laid the groundwork for systematic racial ideologies. Francois Bernier's 1684 essay was among the first attempts to classify humanity into races based explicitly on physical characteristics. Beyond previously mentioned aspects, Bernier's work reflected the empirical, observational approach characteristic of the scientific revolution. His classifications included not only broad geographical groupings but also detailed physical observations such as skin tone, facial structure, and body shape. For instance, Bernier described Africans as having thick lips and oily skin and focused on their hair texture, which he claimed was unlike proper hair, emphasizing physical differences to create fixed categories. Bernier's approach also contrasted with earlier methods of categorization, which relied heavily on cultural, linguistic, or religious factors. While his classifications were imprecise and not yet tied to hierarchical value systems, they were significant for their shift toward using biology as the natural basis for human difference. This transition marked a departure from medieval and Renaissance frameworks that often rooted human variation in environmental or cultural explanations. The 17th century was marked by the expansion of European colonial empires, which created a practical need to categorize the diverse populations encountered in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. Colonial administrators and traders sought to establish hierarchies that justified European dominance and the exploitation of non-European peoples, depicted the world as divided into hierarchical zones, with Europe occupying a central and his observations of African slaves in Arab markets, as well as his admiration for the beauty of Circassian women sold in Ottoman slave markets, reflect the commodification of human beings during this period. These depictions linked physical traits with social and economic roles, embedding racialized ideas within the global trade networks of the time. The intellectual movements of the 17th century, particularly the rise of empiricism and natural philosophy, provided fertile ground for the emergence of racial classification systems. The empiricist focus on observation and classification, as seen in the works of Pierre Gassendi and other contemporaries of Bernier, influenced his methodology. Bernier, a student of Gassendi, applied this empirical lens to human diversity, framing physical traits as observable and measurable criteria for categorization. This intellectual shift also aligned with the broader project of Enlightenment thought, which sought to systematize knowledge. Racial classification became an extension of efforts to organize the natural world, including plants and animals, into discrete categories. Although Bernier's racial taxonomy was rudimentary, it anticipated the more elaborate racial hierarchies that would be developed in the 18th century by thinkers like Carl Linnaeus and John Frederick Blumenbach. A key innovation of 17th century racial thought was its departure from traditional explanations of human diversity rooted in biblical genealogy. Earlier frameworks often traced human variation to the descendants of Noah's sons, a perspective that linked diversity to theological and moral narratives. Bernier, however, rejected this biblical model, opting instead for classification based on physical and geographical criteria. This secular approach signaled a significant rupture with medieval and early Renaissance thought, paving the way for racial science to develop as an ostensibly objective and empirical discipline. Bernier's classifications extended beyond Europe, Africa, and Asia to include the Americas. However, his treatment of Native Americans was hesitant. He considered placing them in a separate race, but ultimately grouped them with Europeans, suggesting that their differences were not sufficient to justify a distinct category. Despite this inclusion, Bernier portrayed Native Americans as culturally inferior, a view that aligned with colonial attitudes toward indigenous populations. In addition to Native Americans, Bernier described populations in South Asia and the Middle East as part of a broader first race, which he linked to a shared whiteness. However, this categorization was not without its ambiguities. He noted that the darker skin of South Asians was accidental, attributing it to environmental factors like exposure to the sun. This environmental explanation reflected the transitional nature of his racial thinking, which oscillated between physical determinism and older, non-biological frameworks. Although Bernier's classifications were not explicitly hierarchical, his descriptions hinted at a preference for certain groups. For example, he expressed admiration for the beauty of European and Circassian women, using aesthetic judgment as a subtle indicator of superiority. This early linkage of physical appearance with value would become a cornerstone of later racial hierarchies, where whiteness was idealized and associated with cultural and moral supremacy. The role of colonialism and capitalism in shaping racial ideologies during the periods herein covered is deeply intertwined with the development of global trade, economic exploitation, and cultural domination. These forces created a context in which human categorization served to justify the subjugation and exploitation of colonized and enslaved populations. Colonialism and capitalism created economic structures that necessitated the dehumanization and differentiation of laboring populations. As Francois Bernier observed during his travels, the commodification of African slaves and their physical attributes was central to the economies of the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean regions. His descriptions of Africans in slave markets reflected this systematic linkage between race and economic utility, where physical traits were used to define individuals as property. Similarly, the slave trade emerged as a cornerstone of colonial economies, with racial distinctions used to rationalize the enslavement of Africans. These distinctions were not only practical but ideological, reinforcing the notion that certain groups were naturally suited for labor-intensive roles. This belief became a foundational element of racial hierarchies in colonial systems with profound economic consequences. There is a noted historical medieval racial practice highlighting a proto-racial commodification of Jewish and Muslim bodies during the Crusades and through economic restrictions in Europe. However, this commodification reached new heights in the 17th century with the transatlantic slave trade and the broader global expansion of European empires. The systematic treatment of human beings as commodities, classified and valued based on physical characteristics, was both a product of and a driver for capitalistic expansion. Colonialism also amplified the racialization of non-European populations through direct encounters. As Europeans expanded into Asia, Africa, and the Americas, they categorized indigenous and enslaved populations in ways that reinforced colonial hierarchies. The hierarchical organization of colonies, where Europeans occupied governing positions while enslaved Africans and indigenous peoples performed labor, was justified through such racial categorizations. These hierarchies were not merely social constructs, but economic necessities for the efficient operation of colonial plantations, mines, and trade networks. Religion played a dual role in colonial racialization. While Christianity initially promoted the spiritual equality of all humans, colonialism transformed this narrative into a tool of domination. Non-Christian populations were deemed heathens and therefore naturally subordinate to Christian Europeans. This religious justification was entwined with economic motives, as the conversion of indigenous peoples often accompanied the seizure of their lands and resources. The expansion of global trade networks in the 17th century intensified the economic and ideological underpinnings of racialization. The movement of goods, people, and capital created a system in which racial distinctions became markers of economic roles. Africans, for example, were overwhelmingly associated with slavery, while Asian populations were viewed through the lens of exoticism and their contributions to luxury goods like spices and textiles. Colonial administrators developed legal and social systems that institutionalized racial hierarchies. These systems included labor codes, land ownership laws, and restrictions on intermarriage, all of which were designed to maintain European dominance. For example, Bernier's classification of humanity into distinct groups based on physical traits reflected the emerging legal frameworks that regulated colonial societies. These frameworks formalized racial differences and justified the exploitation of colonized peoples. The economic benefit of colonialism necessitated the development of ideologies that rationalized exploitation. By framing certain populations as naturally inferior or suited for labor, colonial powers justified their economic policies. This rationalization extended to cultural and intellectual domains where racial theories like those proposed by Bernier gained traction as scientific validations of colonial practices. The concept of race, as revealed through historical analysis, is an artificial and illegitimate construct designed to divide humanity. Rooted in socio-political, economic, and cultural motives rather than biological reality, race serves as a mechanism of power and hierarchy rather than an accurate reflection of human diversity. By examining its origins and development in antiquity, the Middle Ages, and the early modern period, it becomes evident that race was created to rationalize systems of exploitation and domination, and its persistence underscores the enduring impact of these systems. Modern anthropology and genetics have dismantled the biological basis of race, revealing that the variations used to define racial categories are superficial and do not align with genetic distinctions. Earlier societies did not perceive these traits as markers of fixed or hierarchical divisions. The persistence of racial ideologies is thus a testament to their socio-political utility rather than their scientific validity. Throughout history, race has been used to divide humanity for the benefit of dominant groups. In the medieval period, it justified the exclusion of Jews and Muslims. In the colonial era, it rationalized the exploitation of African slaves and indigenous populations. These divisions were constructed to maintain systems of power, whether through religious dogma, economic necessity, or colonial ambition. Race, as explored through historical analysis, is not a biological reality, but a socio-political invention designed to divide and exploit. From the fluid identities of antiquity to the constructed hierarchies of colonialism, militarized the distinction between Christians and Muslims, but also racialized it by portraying Muslims as morally and culturally inferior. These distinctions were tied to European Christianity's universalizing mission and its effort to consolidate internal unity against an external The historical insights herein reviewed underscore that the differences among humans are cultural, contextual, and dynamic, not fixed or biologically determined. The 18th century development of natural taxonomy by Carl Linnaeus stands as a significant milestone in the history of biology. Linnaeus's work, particularly his The System of Nature, sought to impose order on the natural world by categorizing plants, animals, and eventually humans. While this system revolutionized scientific thinking and laid the groundwork for modern biological classification, its extension into human taxonomy introduced deeply problematic assumptions about race that have had lasting philosophical and social implications. Linnaeus's primary aim was to develop a comprehensive system for organizing the diversity of life. His work provided a structured method for naming and categorizing species based on observable characteristics. However, when it came to humans, Linnaeus ventured beyond biology into the realm of socio-cultural judgment. Linnaeus placed humans within the order primates, alongside apes and monkeys, recognizing the close biological relationship between species. However, he further divided Homo sapiens into distinct varieties based on geography, temperament, and physical characteristics. 1. Americanus, red-skinned, choleric, free, ruled by customs. 2. Europaeus, white-skinned, sanguine, muscular, ruled by laws. 3. Asiaticus, yellow-skinned, melancholic, stiff, ruled by opinions. 4. Africanus, black-skinned, phlegmatic, lazy, ruled by caprice. Linnaeus also introduced a fifth category, Homo monstruosus, which included so-called deformed humans, mythical beings, and people from extreme environments, such as Patagonians and Hottentots. Linnaeus's classification was influenced by the ancient theory of the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, yellow bile, which he correlated with different human groups. His assignment of temperament to skin color was based on traditional medical beliefs rather than empirical evidence. Despite these classifications, Linnaeus did not claim that different human groups were separate species. He maintained that all humans belong to a single species, Homo sapiens, distinguishing him from later racial theorists. However, his system laid the groundwork for racial classification, which later thinkers used to justify racial hierarchies. Modern genetics has thoroughly debunked Linnaeus's racial categories. Race, as used in Linnaeus's classification, is now understood to be a social construct rather than a biologically meaningful division. His work contributed to the flawed concept of racial essentialism, which influenced scientific racism in the 19th and 20th centuries. Linnaeus's classification of humans was a product of his time, blending empirical observations with outdated medical and social theories. While his contributions to taxonomy remain intact, his human classification system serves as an example of how scientific ideas can be shaped by cultural biases. Linnaeus's classification of humans and the broader concept of race and taxonomy reveal several philosophical and biological flaws. These flaws, rooted in both scientific misunderstandings and socio-political influences, have had lasting consequences in medicine, anthropology, and social sciences. One major flaw in Linnaeus's classification was its reliance on essentialism, the belief that each group had an unchanging essence. Linnaeus categorized humans into distinct varieties based on external traits and temperament, a method that lacked empirical genetic evidence. This was part of a broader Aristotelian tradition that viewed species as fixed, which later clashed with evolutionary biology. Essentialism falsely assumed that human groups are biologically discrete rather than recognizing continuous variation across populations. Linnaeus's human taxonomy was also built upon contradictory and arbitrary criteria. He classified humans based on geographical regions but linked them to behavioral or moral attributes which are non-biological traits. The classification relied on subjective descriptions, such as calling Europeans inventive and Africans negligent, reflecting ethnocentric biases rather than scientific observations. Linnaeus included Homo monstruosus, mythical or deformed humans, which lacked any rational basis and contradicted his scientific method. Yet Linnaeus' classification laid the foundation for racial categories still used in medicine and society, despite race having no genetic or biological validity. The flawed assumptions include the idea that skin color or skull shape correlates with intelligence or temperament. Modern genetics has shown that human variation is greater within so-called races than between them. Race continues to be used in medical research despite its unscientific basis, leading to misdiagnosis and disparities in healthcare. Linnaeus and later scientists were influenced by social and political pressures rather than pure scientific inquiry. His work was shaped by colonialism and European superiority myths, in that his taxonomy justified European dominance by assigning favorable traits to Europeans and negative traits to others. And legacy in eugenics and scientific racism, in that later scientists misused Linnaean categories to promote racial hierarchies and policies such as eugenics, segregation, and apartheid. Linnaeus' classification of humans into racial categories based on physical appearance and temperament contributed to the foundation of race-based science. These classifications were later adapted by figures such as Johann Friedrich Blumenbach and Georges Cuvier, reinforcing racial hierarchies that persisted in biological and medical studies. In medical fields, racial taxonomies were incorporated into research and diagnosis, often leading to erroneous assumptions about genetic predispositions. Medical literature still reflects racial categories reminiscent of Linnaeus' classifications, affecting patient diagnosis and treatment. Many diseases have been incorrectly attributed to race rather than to environmental, socioeconomic, or genetic factors. Although Linnaeus did not explicitly rank his human varieties, his system was later interpreted in hierarchical terms. The racial taxonomy was incorporated into 19th century scientific racism, which attempted to justify European superiority over other groups. Georges Cuvier, for example, built upon Linnaeus' work describing the so-called Caucasian race as superior in beauty and intelligence, whereas he likened Africans to primates. The idea that different races had inherent temperaments, such as Europeans being governed by laws while Africans were governed by caprice, became entrenched in Western thought and influenced colonial and racial policies. These ideas also played a role in eugenics movements, which sought to control human reproduction based on perceived racial fitness. Linnaean racial taxonomies help solidify the concept of race as a biological reality rather than a social construct, a misconception that persists today. The U.S. Census, for example, historically classified individuals into racial groups similar to those originally outlined by Linnaeus, reinforcing racial divisions in society. The persistence of racial classification systems has led to institutionalized discrimination and structural racism. The widespread belief in racial determinism derived from flawed taxonomies continues to influence policies related to education, employment, healthcare, and criminal justice. The enduring impact of Linnaean racial taxonomies highlights the intersection between outdated scientific classifications and modern social structures. The history of Linnaeus' classification system of race underscores the dangers of conflating biology with socio-cultural constructs. While contemporary genetics has dismantled the biological validity of race, the social consequences of Linnaeus' system remain deeply embedded in scientific, medical, and political institutions. Modern science has unequivocally demonstrated that race is a social construct without a basis in biology. Moving forward, Adopting a more inclusive and scientifically valid framework will help dismantle the legacy of racial essentialism and promote a richer understanding of human diversity. By focusing on individual variation, cultural context, and environmental influences, we may have a living experience where diversity is recognized not as a hierarchy, but as a testament to the richness of human life.